The sky of New York glowed like liquid sapphire. Floating taxis whispered through air lanes between skyscrapers that stretched beyond the clouds, their windows shimmering with holographic rain. On the edge of the city, a girl named Lyra pressed her hand to the glass dome above her bed and whispered, "I wonder what the stars used to look like before the city swallowed the sky." The sky over New York was the color of melted sapphire, and the buildings had learned to hum in harmony with the wind. Airlane taxis floated past like quiet lanterns, their wake rippling the mist that gathered above the avenues. On the 37th story of a tower that grew and slept like a living tree, a girl named Lyra pressed her palm to the ceiling window and watched the city breathe. If you listened closely, New York had a pulse. The Hudson's tide stroke, the spine-deep thrum of wind turbines stitched into the ribs of bridges, the sun-glow of millions of windows that dimmed and lifted like a giant lung. Lyra listened every night, counting the breaths of a city that did not sleep, could not sleep, because sleep had been engineered out. They called it Dreamlight. You did not close your eyes. Dreamlight closed them for you. It seeped in like a benevolent tide, went bright in your nerves, and made fatigue bow its head and withdraw. It was bliss without the uncertainty of dreams, rest without surrender. In 2050, nobody had truly slept in 100 years. "Lights to dawn," Lyra whispered. The glass above her obeyed, shading the room into a soft cobalt, where the floating cove bed rocked itself into a lull. The city's lullabies were engineered too. Tidal hush, distant rain that never quite arrived, the echo of gulls woven into the frequencies that calmed the human spine. But on the edge of that engineered rest, Lyra felt something else. It was a flutter that did not belong to circuits, a ripple of unease or longing that she kept like a contraband bird hidden under her ribs. On most nights she could ignore it. On some nights, like this one, it tapped insistently at the inside of her chest. When the clock in her wall poured out its midnight chime like silver beads, Lyra slid from the bed, set her feet on the warm grown wood floor, and pressed her thumb against the seam of the planks. The boards receded like water. Beneath them, a patchwork of old fibers, a forgotten lattice stitched with copper threads. It had taken Lyra months to find this seam, and weeks to guess how to open it, without triggering the silent alarms that the city wore like jewelry. A glow rose from the gap, a map, but not like the ones woven through the air in every public space. This one was small enough to sit in her palm, and bright enough to look alive. The river was a filament, Central Park, an emerald lung. And in the park's heart, a pinpoint pulsed with a rhythm that was not mechanical. For weeks she had ignored it. For days she had told herself she would not go. Tonight, the tapping in her ribs would not be quiet. She dressed in a coat the color of early light, slipped on boots with soles that remembered every rooftop they had ever touched, and stepped out into a city that leaned forward with her. The corridor outside her pod curved like a nautilus shell, its walls patterned with the slow drift of constellations. Lyra skimmed along, letting the floor carry her weight the way the river carried driftwood. The elevator knew her, the door recognized her bones, and the air lane recognized her route while pretending not to. Everyone was always watched, but the watching had become like the weather, present but rarely personal. Air pressed cool fingers against her face when she stepped out. The tower's balcony was a leaf in a canopy of terraces that wove around the trunks of living buildings. Far below, the old street grid glittered like a jewelry box that had been left open. To the west, the river held the moon. To the east, a faint aurora climbed like a prayer. Lyra skated along the balcony edge and dropped down to a sky bridge swaying between buildings. The bridge had muscles. It flexed against the wind, tightening its tendons when the gusts licked its ribs. She thanked it out of habit, the way children in 2500 were taught to thank their habitats, and ran. Central Park was not far as birds flew, and Lyra felt like a bird. In the old days there were real ones, pigeons and hawks and sparrows and the persistent gulls. But now the birds were drones made to look like birds, and if you didn't look too closely, you could pretend. Tonight, out of the corner of her eye, Lyra thought she saw a shadow flit that was not a drone. It left no signature trace. It left only the idea of wings. The city worked like a puzzle you could move through. Lyra threaded a rope of sky bridges until the park unrolled beneath her. A dark sea stitched with threads of mosslight. The central biosphere rose from the green like a glass mountain, its flanks wet with mist, its interior glowing with heat like the heart of an orchard. The map in her palm pulsed once, twice. Her ribs answered. At the park's northern edge, she found a gate of old iron threaded with ivy. The ivy looked real. When she touched its leaf, it folded around her finger like a tiny hand. "Hello," she breathed, and the leaf warmed. The gate slid open with the soft, grudging sound of a hinge that had known 1,000 winters. Inside, the air changed. It smelled like rain that had fallen 3 hours ago, and then decided to linger. Lyra walked between trees whose trunks shone faintly, where lichen made constellations. The paths explained themselves beneath her feet, small decisions the city made to accommodate her stride. She could feel the city noticing her, not unkindly, but perhaps with curiosity. Her map dimmed. That meant she was close. She turned off the path and moved under a canopy of branches, knit with threads of bioluminescence. In the center of a clearing, a low hill rose like a sleeping animal. On its crest, a stone older than any building in the city, older than the city itself. Beneath that stone, the pulse. Lyra set her hands to it. The stone was cold, and then not. The map hovered on her tongue's back, as if the city's language had shifted to taste. She spoke without words, and the stone moved, and in the hollow underneath, something glowed. It looked like a crystal seed, hardly larger than a berry, filled with a light that swam and went still and swam again. Lyra recognized nothing about its make. That comforted her. She had lived her whole life, surrounded by artifacts that knew her name. This one did not. It existed beyond her provenance, beyond the patents of the Dreamlight Directorate, beyond the polite circle of the city's omniscience. When she lifted it, the park breathed in. Light peeled outward from the seed, a ring, then another, like ripples from a fingertip in water. The rings expanded through the clearing, threaded the trunks, climbed the branches, and went up, 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 into the night, and across the city, like a bell you do not hear so much as remember. In apartments and towers and tunnel homes and overwater palaces, people paused with cups halfway to their mouths. In the museum vaults where whispering AIs rehearsed histories with careful inflection, the lights flickered. In the air lanes, taxis slowed. On the river, the turbines turned once without resistance, as if the river had briefly become silk. A voice that was not a voice uncoiled across the city's bones. Ah. Lyra's knees went soft. The seed rested in her palm like a small sun, and in the space between breaths, she felt the dreamlight step back the way a butler leaves a room when the family needs to speak privately. In that breath, she did not lean on the dreamlight's glow. She leaned on nothing at all, and like falling through warm water, she slept. When she woke, she knew. The first dream was a garden. She found herself at a fountain old enough to be cracked white along its edges. The water did not recycle. It ran new, cold as morning, and tasted faintly of stone. The sky was no longer sapphire. It was blue, and not a perfect blue, which made it more perfect. Under the trees, people slept. They slept on benches and grass. They slept on improvised pillows, on coats, on one another's shoulders. Their faces looked younger and older at once, as if dream had lifted the weary portrait of their days and set underneath it a more faithful copy, the one with laugh lines sharper and grief carved tenderly into the corners. Lyra touched her own face and realized that tears had signed her cheeks with salt. The Dreamlight had never done that. Dreamlight gave you the idea of solace, and you agreed to it. Dreams gave you the real thing, and did not ask permission. When she opened her eyes again, she was in the clearing. The seed had gone quiet, or maybe it had simply learned to glow in a register she could not see. At the base of the hill, someone stood. He was tall and wrapped in a coat the color of snow when the sun has just slid off it. His hair was a graying halo that had outgrown its aesthetic updates. His eyes were the plain, patient brown of river stones. He held a cane he did not seem to need. "Hello, Lyra," he said, as if they had known one another all their lives. "My name is Salvatore, but you can call me Sal. I brought you a thermos of tea." "Did you hear it?" Lyra asked. "That bell?" "I think everyone did," Sal said softly, "but I heard it twice." He tapped the side of his head, "Once in here, and once where I keep the city." She understood then. He was a curator of sorts, the kind the city still employed for the things it wanted to admire without owning. In another century he might have worked in a library or a museum. In this one, he tended the edges of the things Dreamlight could not file. "What is this?" she asked, opening her hand. The seed lay there, patient as a heartbeat. "An invitation," Sal said, "and a blueprint. And a memory. The old words called it a sleep seed, but that's not precise. It doesn't force sleep. It remembers how to offer it. We used to know how, you know. We used to gather darkness like wool and spin it around ourselves. We used to trust the way bodies make their own night. You knew it was here." "I knew it was somewhere," Sal said. "The network has been whispering to itself for a long time, making little secret places where the Dreamlight cannot quite reach. In those places, something old has been knitting, waiting for someone who could look at it and call it by its right name." Lyra flushed. She had not called it anything. She had only held it and fallen asleep as if falling through a door she had been knocking on since birth. "I saw them," she said, "all the people in the park sleeping, and they were—" She groped for the word. "Plural," Sal suggested, "not just 100,000 instances of a single protocol. 100,000 distinct voyages." Lyra nodded hard. Something tugged at the edge of her vision, and when she turned her head, she saw the city's tallest tower leaning closer to listen, like a skyscraper bending toward a child with a secret. "Will the directorate stop this?" she asked. She meant, "Will they come for me?" She meant, "Am I in danger?" She meant, "Am I permitted to be the kind of person who opens a door that changes the weather?" "They will try," Sal said, "but the question is whether they know how to try. A century of ease breeds a century of fragility." He held out his hand. "Walk with me." They passed under branches stitched with constellations of lichen. The lichen pulsed faintly at their footsteps, not in threat, but in greeting, as if every living thing in the park had received the bell and was, in its own manner, glad. "The Dreamlight was born of kindness," Sal said. "It solved problems that felt, at the time, unassailable. Overwork, chronic exhaustion, inequity of rest. It leveled the playing field by leveling the night itself. We were grateful. Then we forgot what we had traded. What did we trade? The right to not know, Sal said. The right to wander in the dark and not be guided. The right to surface with a story only you could have told. Lyra looked down at the seed. It lay perfectly still. Can it spread? Oh, Sal said with a small smile. That is the wrong worry. It already has. The sound you heard, the ripple, that was not signal. It was permission. Cities remember, Lyra. They remember how to sleep. They have just been waiting for an excuse. They reached the lake. The water had learned to mirror not just light, but intent. It showed you not only the sky, but the sky you sought. Tonight it showed a whole firmament crowded with stars. Lyra had never seen it so full. It made her chest ache. Someone will come for you, Sal said, and his kindness made the sentence gentle, without removing its truth. But you will not be alone. When she turned to ask what that meant, he was gone. Only the thermos remained on a bench, steaming faintly in the night that had decided to be night again. They came at dawn, which the city had not had in a long time. The Dreamlight's cycles went on 25-hour increments. Aggressively humane, they said, very gentle on the circadian, free of the crudeness of sunrise. This morning, sunrise opened itself like a hand, and the city remembered how to stand up. Lyra's front door sighed with a politeness it had not needed yesterday, and announced guests. 2 people waited in the corridor like punctuation marks. A woman in grey who had braided her hair to look like columns, and a person whose gender slid around their frame like a silk garment, smiling with everything except the eyes. Lyra Harrow, the woman said. I am Director Mara Ish, Dreamlight Regulation. May we come in? Lyra stepped aside. Her cove bed rocked in the corner. Her wall poured the last of midnight's blue down its sides like syrup. The director accepted a glass of water and did not drink. The smiling aide accepted a cup of tea and did. The city experienced an irregularity last night, Mara said. We're cataloguing node disturbances and looking for the point of origin. Did the irregularity hurt anyone? Lyra asked. On the contrary, the aide said, smile widening. A significant percentage of the city seems to have fallen asleep. The word felt like a secret, knocking against the ribs of the room. Lyra kept her face quiet. The seed lay in a pocket sewn into the lining of her coat, warm as a held hand. We don't suspect malice, Mara continued, but we do suspect romance. Her lips quirked, almost a smile. We have seen this sentiment cyclically in the city's subcultures, the longing for dark, the fetishizing of uncertainty. We'd like to prevent harm before it flowers. Lyra blinked. What harm? The harm of unequal nights, Mara said promptly. Dreamlight gave rest to everyone, not just to those whose lives made sleep possible. To remove Dreamlight is to allow wallets and wars to determine who gets to dream. We cannot return to that Lyra thought of the people in the park, sleeping on one another's shoulders, their faces turned toward the old sky. She thought of how the dream had tasted, a little like peach, a little like the first breath on a winter morning, a little like grieving rightly for a thing you had finally named. What if it doesn't remove anything? She said. What if it adds? Mara regarded her for a long time. You sound like a curator I once knew. Sal? Lyra asked before she could stop herself. Mara's mouth twitched. Yes, kind man. Infuriating. Always smuggling old possibilities through new doors. The aide set down the cup. If you know of any artifacts of interest, you should report them, they said softly. They may be, I hesitate to say dangerous, but they may be catalytic. Catalysts unsettle systems. It's better if the unsettling is done under supervision. Lyra nodded. In the pocket of her coat, the seed lay as pure and unsupervised as a heartbeat. "If I find anything," she said, "I'll let you know." They left without leaving. That was the thing about the directorate. It did not need to occupy your stateroom to occupy your air. After they went, the room felt gently pressed, like dough under the heel of a palm. Lyra stood in the middle of it until the press loosened, then slipped the seed out and set it on the sill. It looked back at her, or she felt looked at. "What are you?" she asked. The seed gave no answer in words, but in the distance, the river turned itself over and sighed. Days passed, and something like weather moved through the city. People fell asleep at odd hours and woke with odd sentences on their tongues. Children who had grown up on the Dreamlight's reliable wash asked their grandparents for stories about lightning and the headaches it gave them. Poets snuck out to rooftops to nap. The tide of Dreamlight continued to run. Nobody had turned off the hum, but now it ran alongside something else, like a river that had remembered its tributaries. Lyra tried to graduate into caution. She lasted a day and a half. She met Sal in a museum whose walls kept their own archives. The air smelled faintly of old paper, even though there wasn't a page in sight. They stood in front of a projection of the city's earliest skyline, stone and wood and ambition and smoke. "Do you know how to plant it?" Lyra asked. Sal's smile looked like a secret and a mercy. "It has already planted itself," he said, "but we can help it root." They went first to the bridges. The old ones remembered how to hold weight and fear together. The new ones had learned how to flex without breaking, and how to sing when the wind asked. On the cables, they left threads of sleep woven so finely that the city's circuits mistook them for decorative flourish. On the walkways, they taught the air to carry a fraction more of night. They visited the libraries, not the ones with shelves, the ones you breathed. In those rooms, you inhaled, and the molecules rearranged into narrative. Lyra and Sal walked very slowly among them and exhaled with great care. A dream, once exhaled, is its own organism, and you do not want to frighten what you mean to set free. At the river, they waded ankle-deep at an hour when the turbines rested. The river was an old animal, patient and unsentimental. It took from the city what it needed and gave back what it could afford. Lyra cupped river into her hands and poured it over the seed. The seed pulsed and fell quiet, not asleep, perhaps, but companionable in the silence. They crossed into boroughs that did not remember being suburbs. In Queens, they found gardens on rooftops that had learned to grow themselves and still liked when people visited. In Brooklyn, they walked through salt gardens, stitching the shore against storm. And Lyra whispered to the salt the old names of sleep: slumber, slake, surrender, Sabbath. The salt accepted the names and kept them like shells. In the Bronx, they learned the rhythms of a market that had moved indoors centuries ago and had never stopped being an outdoor place in its bones. Lyra ate fruit she could not name and slept standing up in the crowd for exactly 1 minute. When she woke, she had in her mouth the taste of the dream of a stranger, cardamom and rain, and the sound of someone calling a dog home in a language she did not speak. Staten Island, still stubbornly itself, brought them to a ferry that rode not waves, but light. The ferry remembered waves anyway. It rocked them a little in sympathy. Lyra fell asleep against a pillar that had once been a mast, and woke with a laugh that was not hers. Sal wiped his eyes and said, without explanation, she must have told him yes. They planted nothing and everything. They scattered permission, the way children scatter bread to ducks in old stories. Too much, too fast, thrilled by the way the water gathers. The city did not reject the bread. It accepted each crumb and built a body with it. That body learned to breathe. The directorate did not sleep either, and not because it could not. It studied. It analyzed. It produced white papers which were not white but a color that had never had a name. It scheduled public forums in which nobody lifted their voices and carefully distributed doubts in the measured portions one uses to season a stew. Mara Ish came to Lyra again, alone this time, and set a hand on the sill not far from the seed. "There is a cost to this," she said. "Dreams wake teeth that you cannot put back." Lyra looked at Mara and imagined her asleep. In her imagination, Mara smiled in the unguarded way of children and people who have finally relinquished their last argument. "What teeth?" Lyra asked softly. "Hunger, fear, ambition," Mara said. "We designed Dreamlight to smooth the serrations, to keep us from cutting each other on our own wanting." "And did it work?" Lyra asked. Mara answered too quickly. "Yes." They stood a while, listening to the tower shift its weight against the wind. "I was 5 when they gave me my first Dreamlight," Mara said finally. "I remember the thrill of not being at the mercy of night. I promised myself I would protect that feeling. Some promises shape you, like a shoe shapes a foot. Lyra did not say, "I'm trying to protect something too," though she was. She did not say, "What if the thing you protected is the thing we need to risk today?" She only said, "You're welcome here." "If you want to rest," Mara's face opened and closed like a hand, working at an unyielding knot. "I don't know how," she admitted. "Not alone." "You won't be." Lyra touched the seed. It warmed. Across the city, 1,000 shades lowered. Across the river, a gull made from metal and wonder decided for 1 minute to forget it was not alive. Mara sat on the floor. Lyra sat beside her. The seed did not flash or sing. It only waited as long as they did, and then longer, and then the two women went under together, not drowned but baptized into something that remembered them better than any archive. Mara dreamed of her mother singing in a kitchen that no longer existed. Lyra dreamed of a door that had been closed since the world was young and now stood open. When they woke, the city had shifted by a degree nobody could measure, and everyone could feel. Mara stood and straightened her coat and said, "There will be a vote." "For the Dreamlight?" Lyra asked. "For what comes next?" Mara said. The vote took place in the oldest new way, not with hands or screens, but with attention. The city listened. It listened to conversations at ferry rails and whispers in kitchen corners. It listened to laughter in long hallways and to the sound people make when they see stars for the first time. It listened to rage, too, because rage is a truth, even when it is not a compass. It listened the way a river listens, by holding and moving at once. During the week of listening, Lyra slept in different neighborhoods each night. She lay on museum floors and under the shadows of bridges, on roofs that remembered rain, and in doorways that remembered migration. People brought her blankets and asked her to tell the story again of the first night, and then they told her theirs. A boy in Harlem dreamed he was a comet and woke with the taste of iron in his mouth, and the certainty that he would build a garden for birds. A chef in Flushing dreamed her grandmother's hands moving across dough like light over water, and woke with a recipe she had never been taught. A conductor in the subway dreamed the tunnels breathing, and woke with a symphony shaped like a map. By the time the city finished listening, the conclusion was not unanimous, and therefore honest. Some wanted what they had always had. Some wanted night only on weekends. Some wanted a curriculum for dreams, which made Lyra laugh until she saw that they meant it kindly. They wanted to keep one another safe. Some wanted to ban the seed, break it, tuck it down a well. What the city wanted was this: to keep the dreamlight, because mercy earned should not be squandered, and to keep the seed, because mercy without risk becomes anesthesia. To run both rivers alongside one another, and make dozens of little bridges between them. To learn how to choose. The directorate published a statement that had enough grace in it to surprise Lyra, and enough caution in it to satisfy Mara's shoe. Dreamlight would persist, but it would cede night to those who asked. The sleep seed would be studied, but not dissected, tended, but not tamed. The city would teach sleep again, how to court it and be courted by it, how to yield to it early and how to argue it into dawn. Children would learn lullabies from elders who remembered the old ones, and new ones written by poets who had never met a dark they didn't want to name. The first night of the new order, the skyline lit itself not like a crown, but like a hearth. Lights went out floor by floor, not in fear but in solidarity, and the towers looked for one breath like mountains. Lyra stood on her balcony, the seed warm in her hand. "Sleep well," she told the city. "Dream brave." The city, for the first time in a century, answered out loud. "You too." She slept. Years braided themselves into something strong enough to carry weight. Lyra became older in the way trees do. You could not see it in the face unless you knew what to look for. But in her rings, she was a forest. Sal retired without retiring, which is to say he kept showing up wherever the city had a seam. Mara learned to nap on ferries and to laugh while doing nothing. The smiling aide left the directorate to open a school for dreaming, where nobody graded anything, and everyone was asked, gently, to be kind to their monsters. New York did what it had always done. It took a new thing and made it itself. In towering apartments, compromise and generosity negotiated their treaties. On street corners, buskers sang lullabies between noon and lunch. In hospitals, doctors learned to prescribe practices that began with the words, "if you want to," and nurses learned how to stand guard overnight, the way you stand guard over fire. Hands close enough to feel the heat, far enough not to smother it. The river remained indifferent and fond. It bore barges and promises and letters that people were pleased to write again on paper, which stubbornly refused to go away. It also bore the dreams people whispered into bottles when they suspected they wouldn't say them any other way. Bottles turned up in salt gardens and greenhouse gutters and the laps of statues who pretended not to notice. One day, a child tapped on Lyra's door. He was 6, and everywhere on his face the future had written, "I will," and "I want," and "I wonder." In his hands, a seed. "It was in the roots of the big tree," he said solemnly. "It looks like yours." Lyra took it carefully. It glowed like a word on the tongue that your throat is not yet sure it can shape. "Do you know what it is?" she asked. He considered. "A friend?" "That will do," she said. "That will do beautifully." That night, New York slept early and rose late, as if it had given itself a holiday. The sky over the river was large enough to hold everything. In the buildings, people dreamed without saving their dreams to a cloud. In the parks, the lichen constellations pulsed like lullabies. Under the oldest oak, the ground hummed a song that trees know and people sometimes remember in time. Lyra lay down on her leaf-wide bed and thought of the city she had been born into and the city she had helped to grow. She felt the breath of towers, the soft turning of turbines, the ferry's old memory of waves. She felt the ache of her own ribs, where once something had knocked until she answered. She smiled. Somewhere in the great many rooms of her life, a door stood open. On its threshold, the old world and the new one sat cross-legged, sharing a bowl of sweet dark. Sleep, she told herself. The city, the river, the stars that had learned to come close when called. Sleep. We have earned it. And New York, vast and particular, glittering and gentle, the city that had never slept and then learned to nap and then to dream, closed its bright eyes and listened to the night knit itself back together around its heart.